You can have your
Main event of the evening.
ready to race to you.
These days are
Hello and welcome to These Days Are Ours, a Happy Days podcast. I'm Peter.
And I'm Joe.
And today we are discussing Season 8's finale, American Musical.
Okay, Peter, tell us what happens in American Musical.
We open with Chachi doing his history homework in the Cunningham's kitchen. He stops to daydream about basketball.
Basket by our cola, and the fans go wild.
And then Fonzie enters to check on his progress. Chachi complains that history is just a bunch of guys running around in funny pants. Fonzie says that history is his best subject, and he'll help. Chachi explains that his essay is about immigration.
They want me to write about America being described as a melting pot.
All right, that's true. Put down a big T.
No.
And Fonzie says Chachi needs to think about it one person at a time. Take Joni's great-grandmother, whose boyfriend left Ireland in 1845 during the potato famine.
He's got to leave. He's got to leave her. He's got to leave his country.
Why?
Everything. No jobs.
Then there's a scene of Joni and Chachi in 19th century costumes, singing a song to each other about how much they'll miss each other.
Long after you'll always have me.
Back in the 1960s, Chachi remarks that he's glad there aren't any potato famines now. Next up, they discuss a European in the 1600s imprisoned for insulting his king.
He sees the king, right? Talks to the guy next to him. He says, well, look at that. The king is a tubbo. Hey, don't let your tummy hit the ground, right?
Deciding to travel to America. Then there's a scene of Potsy, Roger, Al, Fonzie, Howard, and Chachi in anachronistic stripy prisoner uniforms, singing about how they're miserable but scared to immigrate to America because of all the hardships.
I ain't getting in that creaky old boat. Because if I fall off, I don't swim or float. If I don't float, that's all she wrote.
Then Potsy leaves them in a rousing number about thinking positive.
You gotta think positive.
Think positive.
Back in the 1960s, Chachi says he has to write about the cultural influences that immigrants have had on America. Fonzie describes culture as a source of strength in times of trouble, using a Mexican-American family, played by our very white cast.
A toast to my home and family.
On the subject of personal hardships, Fonzie uses the example of Roger's Russian side of his family, demonstrated through Roger, Howard, and Marion singing as they prepare to smuggle their son over the border on a borscht wagon.
Now, it's a good 2 weeks to the border, so if you have to go to the bathroom, you better go now.
Finally, Fonzie discusses his and Chachi's Uncle Giuseppe, who came over from Italy in 1904 and sold pretzels. As played by Fonzie, he gives a speech about how America is a place where you can start with nothing and end up with something, and live by your convictions.
One day I'm going to have a different kind of store. Maybe one without a wheel and a wall. I'll have a wall, a door, maybe a bathroom.
Then the entire cast does a reprise of Think Positive.
Think positive, think positive, you gotta take a shot in
Thank you, Peter. That was American Musical. It first aired back on May 26, 1981. Happy Days was followed that night by a new Laverne and Shirley, in which the girls must play every role in a stage play called Murder in Mother Goose Land, with a Broadway producer in the audience. NBC aired another rerun of the canceled Lobo. In this one, Lobo is transporting a criminal by air when the plane is hijacked and Deputy Perkins has to take over for the injured pilot. The title of the episode, by the way, was Airsick 1981, a parody of the airport movies. And CBS aired the 1977 animated movie Race for Your Life, Charlie Brown, in which Charlie and his friends compete in a rafting race down the river against some cheating bullies.
The Peanuts gang is looking for a summer of fun.
I've been drafted.
They're off to a clean start, making new friends and learning the ways of the great outdoors.
It's only bears and tigers out there.
Race for your life, Charlie Brown.
Peter, on that night, May 26, 1981, what are you watching?
I'm watching Charlie Brown. Sorry, Happy Days.
I am absolutely watching Race for Your Life, Charlie Brown. There is nothing that could have stopped me from watching that. For the 1980-81 television season, Happy Days finished in 15th place, tied with Too Close for Comfort. Dallas was the #1 show that season. In fact, CBS had the top 4 shows that year, including Dukes of Hazzard, 60 Minutes, and MASH. American Musical was directed by Jerry Paris, and it was written by James Patrick Dunn and J. Elizabeth Bradley. James Dunn is Happy Days' resident songwriter, the man behind Pumps Your Blood, and Do the Fonzie. He and Jay Elizabeth wrote the songs for this episode too. The most recent of his episodes that we covered was Broadway It's Not. As for Jay Elizabeth Bradley, this was her only sitcom writing credit, but she and James Patrick Dunn co-wrote a song for an episode of Lottery in 1983.
I used to think my life was just a space and time. Lady Luck had turned her head and passed me by.
Lottery is a show that I remember fondly that I don't think anyone else actually watched.
This is the first time hearing of it.
As for guest stars this week, there are none, but we have so many songs. They're all originals. We have to start with Long After, performed by Aaron Moran and Scott Baio. Peter, your thoughts?
At first, I honestly thought they were just going to sing You Look at Me Again. They didn't, but this is in that same vein of extremely boring love songs. It's just very slow and syrupy, and I did not enjoy it.
This gets the episode off to a bad start, in my opinion. I was disappointed that they didn't even try to come up with something that sounds vaguely Irish.
Yeah, you introduce the fact that they're Irish and you don't give it something with a bit more flair.
We need to talk about your flair.
Come on.
This is completely devoid of flair. It is a very boring ballad, and I was glad when it was over. One thing I noticed during Long After is that Aaron Moran's singing is right on. She sings quite nicely, but Scott Baio's voice is very wobbly and shaky, and I'm not sure that he's hitting all the notes.
He is not. He's not a singer.
You're the wave in the shell, so far from the sea.
Which was surprising because he actually released an album in the 1980s. I don't know how he did that.
You've got such a pretty face.
I mean, John Travolta did too, and he can't sing at all.
No, John Travolta actually had a couple of hits.
You gotta let her in.
But the next song is a little bit more upbeat. It's called The Immigration Blues. And it's performed by Anson Williams, Tom Bosley, Scott Baio, Al Molinaro, Ted McGinley, and Henry Winkler. What did you think of this one?
Considerably more enjoyable, I have to say. I have to admit, I like the fact that they found a way to make the entire cast sound halfway decent, considering that Henry Winkler is not a singer.
I would say that this is the singingest that Henry Winkler gets on the show.
I don't buy that the world is flat. Beds are cool and I can swim like a snake.
And I also like the choreography quite a bit.
It was fun.
It's followed immediately by Think Positive, performed by Anson Williams. What did you think of this one?
I guess this song is kind of the thesis statement of the episode, considering it gets reprised at the end. And I guess it sort of fits the episode, considering it's a very optimistic view of immigration. I don't know that I like it, but it's catchy.
It's hard to know what to say about this as a piece of music because obviously it's just meant to be a very upbeat pep song. You know, it's sort of an anthem to pump you up and get you excited about getting on the boat to go to America. I think Anson gives it a good spirited performance. The next song is called Que Viva Mi America, and it's performed by Al Molinaro, Linda Goodfriend, and Kathy Silvers with the entire cast.
America, que viva mi America. There's no place in America. It's home for me.
What did you think of this one?
There are white Mexicans, but it's still really uncomfortable to have our very non-Hispanic white cast playing a Mexican-American family, and I think that kind of just colored the entire scene for me. But I will say it's nice that Lori Beth got to sing a little bit.
Lori Beth not only gets to sing, but dance as well, and Henry Winkler is dancing up a storm, jumping up on that chair. The actors are so weirdly miscast in this scene that at first I did not recognize what ethnicity they were supposed to be. It actually took the song until they started singing a little bit in Spanish for me to realize that they were supposed to be Mexican. At first I thought they might be Romanian or something. After that we have Shine Bright on Me America, performed by Ted McGinley.
In America, America, shine bright on me, America.
With Tom Bosley and Marion Ross joining in. What did you think of this one?
It's another slow one. It's better than Joni and Chachi's Snooze Fest, but not by much.
Ted McGinley was a great sport this week because I don't think he was hired to sing and dance, but he does both in this episode, and he has to sing this very, very corny, very slow, earnest number.
I've gotta hitch my wagon to that star.
And he does it with a lot of sincerity, so I was impressed by Ted McGinley here, but the song didn't make much of an impression on me. And of course, the final song of the episode is that reprise of Think Positive, performed by the entire cast. Any thoughts on that one?
Same as before.
Fair enough. It's a very corny, upbeat number. Not much to say about it, but I did love the doo-wop version of Think Positive that plays over the end credits.
Whoa, think positive.
Yeah, that was a fun fun one.
I wish that there was some way to incorporate that into the regular episode, but at least it gets to be in the end credits. As for cultural and historical references this week, Fonzie correctly names the first three American presidents, George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, but the Revolutionary War ended in 1783, and George Washington didn't become president until 1789. So who was in charge during those in-between years?
Through the good or lean years, and for all the in-between years.
Well, it was several people, including
John Hanson, Elias Boudinot, Thomas Mifflin, Richard Henry Lee, John Hancock, Nathaniel Gorham, Arthur St. Clair, Cyrus Griffin, and Samuel Huntington.
Fonzie says he was going to name all 25 presidents. The 25th president was William McKinley, who was assassinated in 1901. This episode takes place in 1963, so America would have been on its 35th president, John F. Kennedy.
Are you saying that Fonzie might not be as good at history as he says he is?
I'm beginning to suspect that there may be some gaps in his knowledge of American history, yes. Fonzie mentions the Great Spud Famine of 1845, also known as simply the Great Famine or the Great Hunger. This was a period of mass starvation in Ireland that lasted from 1845 to 1849. It led to millions of deaths and to millions more leaving the country. Because these events were triggered by a potato blight, the Great Hunger is often called the Irish Potato Famine, though this term is mainly used outside of Ireland. Fonzie also talks about people being given the choice between jail and America.
What kind of choice is that? Who wouldn't choose America?
Chachi, let me tell you something. Sailing to America was not a piece of cake. You know, those boats did as much sinking as they did sailing.
In truth, from the late 1700s to the mid-1800s, Britain sent thousands of convicts to America as punishment. These individuals were banished for terms of 7 to 14 years, after which they could theoretically return to England if they wanted to. Some of these convicts were women who were accused of such vague crimes as being quote-unquote lewd or simply walking the streets after 10 at night. I didn't know you could get banished for that, but you could.
From France, we got French toast. From Rome, we got Romanians. From the Swedens, we got M1.
Fonzie says that we get French toast from France. This is not exactly true. The earliest version of this dish goes back to Imperial Rome, circa 300 AD. It was popularized in America by French immigrants, hence the current name. Fonzie also says that we got Anne Margaret from Sweden. Yes, the singer, actress, and dancer Anne Margaret, best known for films like Bye Bye Birdie and Viva Las Vegas, was born in Sweden. Her real name is Anne Margaret Olsen. She came to America when she was about 5 years old.
Oh, neat.
I did not know that until this week, so Happy Days did teach me something. Chachi and Fonzie enjoy some animal crackers. These are Barnum's animals, marketed by Nabisco since 1902.
Is that a giraffe? No, it's a tiger. That's all right.
They were famously sold in boxes made to look like circus train cars with the animals in cages. In 2018, however, the cages were removed from the packaging, and the animals are now depicted in a natural setting. I did not know that they had taken the cages off of the animal cracker boxes. Did you?
I did not realize that either.
So this episode taught me a second thing. Roger's Russian grandfather hid on a quote-unquote borscht wagon. Borscht is a type of soup made from beets, so it would probably not be transported in wagons. Perhaps Fonz means a wagon carrying beets with which to make borscht. What did you think a borscht wagon was?
I just thought it was a wagon that carried borscht.
And maybe if you were selling it in the streets, like a street vendor might have a borscht wagon. I don't know. Fonzie jokes that his entire family was planted in America by Johnny Appleseed. Johnny Appleseed's real name was actually John Chapman, and he was an American outdoorsman of the late 1700s and early 1800s. He didn't just plant apple trees randomly as he traveled. He actually started nurseries in different states and would occasionally return to tend to them.
I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places.
Fonzie quotes John F. Kennedy, "Don't ask what your country can do for you, you ask what you can do for your country." The actual quote comes from Kennedy's inaugural address on January 20th, 1961. "And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Fonzie also quotes Ben Franklin, "God helps those who help themselves." This quote is often traced back to Poor Richard's Almanac in 1757. In truth, it was originated by a British politician, Algernon Sidney, in 1698. Fonzie mentions something about Jesse Owens climbing a mountain. James Cleveland Owens, nicknamed Jesse, a track and field athlete from Oaksville, Alabama, is not known to have climbed any actual mountains, but he did win 4 gold medals at the notoriously tense 1936 Olympics in Berlin. He set 3 world records and tied another in the span of an hour, challenging Hitler's theory of Aryan supremacy. Fonzie then quotes Vince Lombardi, "When the going gets tough, the tough get going." Born in Brooklyn in 1913, Lombardi was one of the most famous football coaches in American history, best known for being the head coach of the New York Giants from 1954 to 1958 and the Green Bay Packers from 1959 to 1967. There is no strong evidence to suggest that Lombardi ever said this famous quote. It's been attributed to various football coaches, including Frank Leahy. Fonzie mentions New York songwriter Irving Berlin and his famous composition, God Bless America. Berlin wrote this patriotic song in 1918 during World War I, then revised it in 1938 as the world was headed toward another war. Predictably, Fonzie mentions the Lone Ranger. We had plenty of Lone Ranger references last week, so just listen to our previous podcast. I don't want to talk about him again this week. And Fonzie ends his litany of quotes with one from Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream. King delivered this as part of a famous speech from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. on August 28, 1963, as part of an event called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
He just quotes the part about having a dream and not about what that dream is, which is an end to institutional racism in America. Because I guess if they mentioned that, they would have to acknowledge that America kind of sucks. And they don't want to do that in this episode.
No, you can't actually mention any of the problems that Martin Luther King was addressing in that speech because it would bring the whole show down. Other observations this week. Why is Chachi writing his report at the Cunningham's house anyway? Is it too chaotic to work at his family's apartment because of Uncle Gonzo? Perhaps the chaotic atmosphere at Chachi's apartment might be behind his academic troubles. What do you think?
Possibly. It's also possible that they don't have that set at this moment, maybe.
That, I think, is probably the real explanation. We get another Fonzie malapropism this week. That's your problem in an eggshell. He obviously means nutshell. I'll be honest, I am tired of Fonzie malaprops. I never find them funny. I'm tired of him mangling words and famous phrases and stuff. I wish they'd stop, but I don't think they will. But some appreciation, please, for that somersault that Ted McGinley does from the bench in the prison cell and the stage dive that Henry Winkler does at the end of the show.
Yeah, whoever the choreographer deserves like a raise.
And I liked that the actors threw themselves into this, sometimes literally. And I'm not sure it was intentional when Anson Williams' hat fell off during Think Positive, because his hat gets stepped on a little bit during the rest of the number.
Well, maybe we just fix the choreography.
What do you mean?
So they won't trod upon it.
Did you notice that his hat falls off?
Yes, it was delightful.
I like when stuff like that happens on the show. And we praised last week's show for its subtlety and nuance. I don't think we'll make the same comment this week, since the show climaxes with Henry Winkler literally standing on a soapbox.
Yeah, this entire episode is just blatant, isn't America great propaganda, and I did not care for it. I did not care for it at all.
I wondered why they did this episode at the time, because I saw the promos that were done in 1981, and they did not promote this episode as a musical or as a celebration of America at all. The selling point was the Happy Days gang goes to jail.
Tuesday goes wild.
It's unbelievable.
When the Happy Days gang lands in the Slammer.
Think positive.
That was how this was marketed.
Oh my God, that's amazing. I want to see that episode instead.
Well, you sort of did. You see like 75% of the cast of the show in a jail cell for a big part of it. Maybe this episode was inspired by the fact that at the time there was a very popular song by Neil Diamond called America, which was about immigration. It was released in 1980 on the soundtrack to The Jazz Singer, and it was becoming a big hit during the summer of 1981. So it would have been very much in the zeitgeist at this time. And at least America by Neil Diamond is a pro-immigration song.
On the boat and on the plane, they're coming to America.
So, Peter, were there any outstanding Happy Days fashions in American Musical?
This is another episode that's just an elaborate excuse to put the cast in old-timey costumes. So my personal favorite were the incredibly anachronistic prisoner uniforms the male members of the cast were wearing for Immigration Blues and Think Positive. I don't think that's how prisoners in the 1600s dressed. They're just wearing the cliche cartoon stripy prisoner uniforms, complete with matching hats. I also want to give a shout out to Joni's 1840s Irish woman costume, which reminds me of nothing so much as Little Bo Peep. It's very, very frilly, and she's got a kind of a Little Miss Muffet hat, and Chachi is wearing this suit and top hat that kind of makes him look like community theater Artful Dodger.
Chachi looks like he's dressed to go caroling or perhaps wassailing, and I looked into Joni's hat, what that's called, and I found out it's called a mop cap.
Oh.
Sometimes called a muffin cap or mob cap. It started out being a hat worn by married women, but by the Victorian era, which is when the scene takes place, it was mainly worn by servants. I thought those costumes were the best part of the scene.
Absolutely. And I also want to give a shout out to Roger's Russian man costume, which is very form-fitting. Ted McGinley pulls it off very well.
Oh yeah, he rocks that outfit. So Peter, I will ask that age-old timeless question. Was this episode any good?
Yeah, it's blatant pro-American propaganda. It's just about how America is great and right on and a haven for immigrants from all over the world. And it's like sure, yeah. whatever you say show. I did like the costumes, though. The costumes were fun, but the rest of the episode is just uncomfortable to watch for me.
I at least appreciated that it was a pro-immigrant show and a pro-immigrant story. Fonzie even says that immigrants are fun, and there's been so many ugly things said about immigrants in the last few years, and so much ugly anti-immigrant sentiment in America.
Well, yeah, but also all of the immigrants in this episode are white. When we talk about the way that immigrants are targeted in America, I don't think that we can discount the fact that that is rooted in xenophobia and racism. We do have a Mexican-American family in this episode, but they're white.
I was at least happy to hear something nice said about immigrants in any way. I don't know why they chose to do this, but I was happy that it gave the cast a chance to sing and dance and wear costumes. I don't know that it all adds up to anything worthwhile, but the actors seem to be enjoying themselves. So there's something to say in American Musical's favor. I wouldn't say to avoid this one because it's such a bizarre episode that people should watch it anyway, just to see it. But I don't think you're going to actually learn anything about American history or the actual treatment of immigrants in America from this. So, Peter, are you ready with your top 5 episodes of season 8 since we've come to the end of the season?
I am.
Number 5.
Number 5, what do you do when you want to further a character's plot, but you can't get the actor to come back? Well, you have one of your actresses marry a phone. In a surprisingly clever twist in RC and LB Forever.
This episode was remarkably moving and poignant, considering that one of the main characters never appears on camera. So kudos to the rest of the cast and the writers for making a meaningful and significant episode without Ron Howard's involvement at all. My number 5 episode for the year actually introduces Ron Howard's replacement on Happy Days, and it's called Hello, Roger. And it's about how Roger comes to Milwaukee after his heart is broken and he gets off on the wrong foot with Fonzie and just generally has a rotten day.
That episode did not crack my top 5, but it is very fun. And Ted McGinley, I'm glad he's on the show now.
I wouldn't want to be the fake Richie Cunningham on Happy Days, but I think Ted McGinley is up to the task.
Number 4.
Number 4 basically serves as kind of a prequel to RC and LB Forever. I don't think it does great by Lori Beth, but it does give Marion quite a bit to do, and it also casts a more critical eye on some 1960s cultural touchstones. It's Dreams Can Come True.
Peter, by a strange coincidence, Dreams Can Come True is my number 4 episode of the season as well. I like that it gave Marion and Lori Beth a story together. This is a great showcase for Marion Ross, maybe her best of the season. And I love the parody of 1950s game shows, particularly a very manipulative and mean-spirited show called Queen for a Day. And Lyle Wagner is so great as the sleazy, insincere host of this game show.
Number 3.
Number 3 is a fascinating look into Fonzie's psyche, and it's named after an Alice Cooper song, Welcome to My Nightmare.
Well, I will have more to say on this episode in a moment because, wink, wink, it actually made my list as well. This is Happy Days at its most goofy and bizarre, and I loved it. Fonzie Gets Shot was my number 3 episode for season 8. It's a Rashomon parody that I think gives us different perspectives on the same story. I think it's a fascinating experiment, and the cast really gets into it. I loved it.
And Fonzie got shot in the butt. That's always fun.
We get to say butt a lot in our podcast. Always a fun time.
Number 2.
Number 2, Fonzie gets shot. He got shot in the butt, and I got to say that he got shot in the butt multiple times. And it's also a Rashomon episode, which is kind of an obligatory thing for every TV show to do. And those are always fun.
My top 2 episodes of the season were basically tied. I went back and forth on which should be number 1, which should be number 2, and they are at extreme opposites of the spectrum in terms of realism. One is a very serious and dramatic episode. One is a very goofy and fantastic episode. My number 2 was Mother and Child Reunion.
Number 1, Mother and Child Reunion. It's another look at Fonzie's turbulent familial relationships, and it was a remarkably sweet one. It's got one of my favorite guest stars on all of season 8, and we also got to see Eugene get bullied a little, which was some fun comic relief in what is otherwise a pretty serious episode. And we also got to see some subtlety, some nuance, some restraint in a show that can be a little bit emotionally manipulative at times, let's say.
My number 1 was Welcome to My Nightmare. Welcome to My Nightmare is Happy Days at its most unrealistic and silly. It's literally a fever dream. We have a mad scientist / vampire played by Dick Gautier, and we have Fonzie's cool being transferred to a clone of him, and we get to see Scott Baio chained up in shackles on the wall, which is sort of satisfying in and of itself. itself. That was why it was my number one episode of season 8. Did you have any honorable mentions for season 8?
Yes. It Only Hurts When I Smile, Scholarship, and Hello, Roger.
My honorable mentions for season 8 were RC and LB Forever, White Christmas, and Howard's Bowling Buddy. So, Peter, what were your overall thoughts on season 8?
I have to admit, season 8 was better than I remembered it being the first time I watched it. The first time I watched it, I was just kind of annoyed that Richie was gone and they were trying to find their footing without him and Ralph. And this time around, I was able to be a lot more fair to it. So I'm glad for that. When it was boring, it was pretty boring. But when it was fun, it was very, very fun. But also, I am seriously sick of Chachi. He is the worst, and his relationship with Joni is just unpleasant and uncomfortable. And I know it's not going to get better.
Season 8 does have a regrettable amount of Chachi, but overall, I think it's very impressive that season 8 is not a disaster. They lost 2 of their main characters, including the nominal lead of the show, and Happy Days could have gone into a tailspin after that, but they didn't. And I think that one of the things that helped this season was the actors' strike that forced them to start later than they normally would, because we only got 22 episodes this season instead of, what do they normally do, 25, 26?
Yeah.
Whittling it down to 22 actually made the season a little bit better. When I looked over the 22 episodes that they did this year, I see a handful that I really liked, but I don't see any major disasters, no huge missteps. And I think we need to talk a little bit about how the newcomers to Happy Days changed the show. Of course, we've talked already about Ted McGinley as Roger, and he has the unenviable task of being the Ron Howard substitute. But there was another major addition to the cast this year, and that is Kathy Silvers as Jenny Piccolo. And I think she's the best addition to the cast that there is in the later years. I think she brings a lot of humor to the show during a time when it otherwise might have been sagging in terms of energy.
Absolutely. Kathy Silvers as Jenny Piccolo is just a delight every time she's on screen. She knows how to pick locks. She buys questionable products through the mail and then plans to sell them to her sister. She gets to be fun and exciting and make bad decisions in a way that I think teenage girls don't get to do a lot in fiction. And that's why I am so glad that she is here. And I'm so glad that she gets to be kind of the fun counterpart to Joni, who is trapped in her incredibly boring thing with Chachi.
The existence of Jenny actually gets Joni to have some more fun storylines, because most of the stuff with Chachi is sappy, mushy, romantic stuff that's not very interesting. So at least with Jenny, she gets into some shenanigans and hijinks, and I think that adds a level of fun to the show. I only wish that Jenny had been on the show a few seasons earlier when Happy Days was in its prime, but I'm glad that she's here under any circumstances. So, Peter, how can people keep up with us and find out about all the wonderful things that we are doing?
Listeners can follow us on Twitter at Fonzie Podcast. They can follow me on Twitter at Peter Volfranc. That's PeterVulfranc.
And they can follow me on Twitter at Joe_A_Blevins. They can find this podcast online at thesedaysaroours.libsyn.com. And they can email us with questions, comments, and concerns at thesedaysaroourspodcast@gmail.com. So, Peter, what do we have on the docket for next week?
Next week, season 9 starts off in the form of video messages sent to the lost Richie in Home Movies.
Sounds like a very intriguing episode. So, see you later, alligator.
In a while, crocodile.
Ask not what your country can do for you.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask not. Ask not. Ask not. Ask not. Ask not what your country can do.
Ask what you can do for your country.
Ask what you can do for your country.
Let us never negotiate out of fear.
Us never negotiate, negotiate, negotiate. Let us never negotiate, negotiate out of fear.
But let us never fear to negotiate.
But let us never fear to negotiate, negotiate, negotiate. Let us never fear to negotiate, negotiate out of fear.
Ask not what your country can do for you.
I've gotta hitch my wagon to that